special report. Now reporting, David Muir.
Good afternoon. We're coming back on the air because the NTSB is now holding a briefing on this deadly mid-air collision between an American Airlines flight and a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter here in Washington, D.C. You can see we're here on the banks of the Potomac. Let's listen.
The National Transportation Safety Board is an independent federal agency that's charged by Congress with investigating every civil aviation and serious accident and serious incident in the United States and significant events in other modes of transportation. I want to start by expressing our deepest condolences, our sympathies on behalf of the entire board for those who lost loved ones in this terrible tragedy. Our thoughts, our prayers are with you. Entire communities were affected, and we are thinking of you. With me today is Bryce Banning. Bryce is a senior aircraft accident investigator with the National Transportation Safety Board. He's also going to serve as our investigator in charge of this investigation. Also with me today is the entire board. We have Todd Inman, member Todd Inman. Todd is going to serve as the board member on scene, the spokesperson for this investigation. All of the board members will be here. We have Vice Chairman Alvin Brown, member Mike Graham, who lived in Wichita for 20 years, and we also have member Tom Chapman. The NTSB's headquarters is just a mile from here. And so we are all here because this is an all-hands on-deck event. And we're here to assure the American people that we are going to leave no stone unturned in this investigation. We are going to conduct a thorough investigation of this entire tragedy, looking at the facts. Now, with that, I want to level set. When we go to the scene, and we were here last night, we allow the responders to do their important safety mission, which in this case was search and rescue and recovery. We stand back to allow them to do their important safety mission. And so this, for us, is our first full day on scene with our entire crew coming together. We have about nearly 50 people on scene, and in addition to our resources back at headquarters in our labs and throughout the agency. So with that said, we are not going to get into specific facts in this press conference. I want to level set here. We're going to get into our investigative process. As we are able to confirm factual information, we will provide that. I do want to say this is a whole of government effort. I was able to brief, along with others, the President of the United States and the Vice President this afternoon. I want to thank them for their leadership, for their tremendous support of the NTSB, for our investigators, and for the responders that are on scene doing an important mission. I also want to thank Secretary Sean Duffy, who I was communicating with early on after we first got word of this tragedy. We've been working together throughout the day, along with his team at the DOT and within FAA. I also want to thank Secretary Pete Hegseth, who was also integral in working with us today. Chris Rocheleau, the acting administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration. We've heard from many members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, and so I will say this is a tremendous, one more time, whole of government effort. I also want to take a moment and thank the many, many responders that have been on scene. It has been an incredible effort, and I will have a full list that I will provide, that we will provide tomorrow, but I do want to thank them for all their work. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Member Inman for additional remarks.
So today is our first full day on scene. Our investigative team will be on scene as long as it takes in order to obtain all of the perishable evidence and all the fact-finding that is needed to bring us to a conclusion of probable cause. Our mission is to understand not just what happened, but why it happened, and to recommend changes to prevent it from happening again. Since we're just beginning our investigation, we don't have a great deal of information to share right now. We will keep you informed by giving regular updates as we learn more. Our intention is to have a preliminary report within 30 days, and the final report will be issued once we've completed all of our fact-finding and investigation. Now, we will not be determining the probable cause of the accident while we're here on scene, nor will we speculate about what may have caused this accident. Today, we will be going and having an organizational meeting and establishing our parties to our investigation. We currently have the following parties that are already identified: PSA Airlines, GE Aerospace, Sikorsky, FAA, NACTA, which represents the air traffic controllers, ALPA, which represents the pilots, Army, AFA, which represents the flight attendants. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada will be an accredited representative under Annex 13 of ICAO. They will be supplemented by MHIRG as a technical advisor. They were previously known as Bombardier. The NTSB offers this party status to those companies, government agencies, and associations that have employees, activities, or equipment involved in the accident. We offer that because they will provide technical expertise and relevant information supporting the development of the best possible factual record. Once they join this investigation, they are not permitted to release documents or talk publicly about the investigation without the consent of the NTSB. So I want to stress this. It is only the NTSB that will provide information related to this investigation, with one exception. Regarding the fatalities that occurred, that notification will be handled by the DC medical examiner. We will not be discussing fatalities or names. That will be handled by them as the proper authority. So we want to talk a little bit about our process. We will analyze the facts and determine the probable cause of the accident, and then issue a report of those determinations. I also want to talk a little bit about some additional people that are here with us, and they're very important to us, and that is our family assistance group. Later today, we will be briefing the families. We normally try to do this before a media event, but in this case, they're still arriving. Our family assistance specialists are already working closely with local officials and others to help assist them in their efforts to support everyone that's affected by this accident. And let me just reiterate what the chair said. A loss of life in an aviation accident is very unusual in the United States, and our heartfelt sorrow goes out to everyone that's affected. It affects us, it affects everyone around us. There are a lot of people hurting today. We will help find out what happened. We will do it factually, and we will do it accurately. As part of this, we are going to be standing up some specific working groups. Those working groups will be operations. They will be looking at the history of the accident flight and crew members' duties for as many days before the crash as appears relevant. We'll be forming a structures group, which will be the documentation of the airframe wreckage and the accident scene, including calculation of impact angles to help determine the plane's pre-impact course and altitude. We'll have a power plants group. They will do the examination of the engines and the engine accessories. We'll have a systems group. They will study the components of the plane's hydraulic, electrical, pneumatic, and associated systems, together with the instruments and elements of the flight control system. We'll have an air traffic control group. They will do reconstruction and review of air traffic control systems provided to and including acquisition of pertinent flight track surveillance information, what you might typically think of as radar or ADSB. along with controller pilot communications. We will also have a survival factors group. They will be doing the documentation of impact, forces and injuries, community emergency planning, and all crash and fire rescue efforts. Also, due to the unique nature of this crash, we will be having a helicopter group as well. Lastly, we will have a human performance group, and this will not be its own group. It will actually be a part of the operations, air traffic control, and helicopter groups. They will study the crew performance and all before the accident factors that might be involved in human error, including fatigue, medication, medical histories, training, workload, equipment design, and work environment. Now we're going to take a few questions, but I will again stress, we don't have a lot of information now. We will continue to gather that. We will try to release it as we can, but we will only talk about the facts of the case that we know right now. I'm going to ask, we'll call on a few people. I'm going to ask that you state your name and affiliation.
James Matthews from Sky News. So we've heard from President Trump today talking about DEI hiring policy within the FAA and associating that with the cause of this accident. What do you say to that?
Well, unfortunately, I didn't hear the remarks. I was briefing House and Senate members, but I believe, Chair, would you like to take that?
As part of any investigation, we look at the human, the machine, and the environment. So we will look at all the humans that were involved in this accident. Again, we will look at the aircraft, we will look at the helicopter, we will look at the environment in which they were operating in. That is standard in any part of our investigation. I'll turn it back.
Chair, can I ask you, has the flight data recorder been recovered yet? And what is the difficulty in a water disaster like this, which presents a very difficult environment for your investigators and the people out on the water?
Well, the question was on the flight data recorders. And we have not recovered the flight data recorders yet. We know they're there. They are underwater. This is not unusual for the NTSB. We have many times recovered flight data recorders in water. We have our lab right here that is about a mile from the NTSB, so it's not unusual. And once we get those, we'll be able to get those read and information from them to be able to provide further information to you. I'm going to turn it back over to Member Inman.
Sir.
Heather Henry with CBS News. Earlier today, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said a mistake was made last night. Based off of you all's initial investigations and preliminary findings, have you all been able to tell whether this was human error or mechanical failure?
The question was, has there been human error or mechanical failure? We don't know what we know just yet. We do not know enough facts to be able to rule in or out human factor, mechanical factors. That is part of the NTSB investigative process and where all of these groups will come together. It's one of the reasons why the NTSB is known as the gold standard. We will take the time that's necessary, but I'd also like to reiterate, if we find something that is a significant issue that warrants immediate action, we will not hesitate to make those recommendations and make them public. We have a good track record on that, and we want to continue doing so. Sir.
Hello, Sir. Tom Costello with NBC News. Does it hurt your investigative process, maybe for the chairman, does it hurt your investigative process to have the president already suggesting possible causes here as you try to keep an open mind and begin this investigation?
Thank you.
Tom, with all due respect, I think the press also likes to state what probable cause is before we get to the probable cause. So what I'm going to say is you need to give us time. You need to give NTSB, it's not that we don't have information. We do have information. We have data. We have substantial amounts of information. We need to verify information. We need to take our time to make sure it is accurate. That's best for you. That's important for the families. It's important for legislators who are seeking answers to try to figure out what they're going to do about this. And so it will take time. We do have a lot of information, but we need some time to verify that.
Yeah, member Chase Williams with Fox Business. I'm wondering about the conditions in the tower last night. Were there any performance issues in the past with any of these controllers? Anything of that?
The question is about controllers. As I said, we are just now forming the groups. The controllers do have union representation, which they are entitled to. They'll be working with our party system and our party groups. They will be conducting interviews. Those interviews will need to be analyzed, transcribed, and other team members will need to look over it. It'll be a long process, but we will go through the entire history.
Michelle Belgray, The Independent. My question is for the chairwoman. Can you tell us more about what the president and the vice president's responses were when you briefed them this afternoon?
Sure. So the question was about my briefing for the president and the vice president. As is standard, we offer briefings on our process and what we know, and this was a briefing with the president and vice president and with Secretary Duffy and Secretary Hegseth and also the acting administrator of the FAA. There was discussion on what we know so far and our process, and that was about it.
Ma'am, Chairwoman, Stephanie Robbins with ABC News. Similar to Tom Costello's question, the president has stated what may have caused the crash, stating common sense. Does that affect your progress at all at this early stage?
Yeah, so the NTSB, we conduct an important safety mission where we take a very careful approach. I'm sorry, the question was on speculating during investigations, which is we often hear about. What I will say is we look at facts on our investigation, and that will take some time. And at some point, we'll be able to provide that factual information, as Member Inman said, and provide that hopefully tomorrow.
Hang on a second. David.
James Jefferson from Reuters. Have you been able to retrieve the black boxes from the helicopter? Has the military decided whether they're going to read those to the NTSB? And what about the ATC tapes?
So the question was about black boxes, which are referred to as black boxes, which are typically orange. We have not recovered any of the boxes involved yet. We feel comfortable and confident that we will be able to. Right now, recovery of life is probably most important in those that were involved. I mean, there are still ongoing recovery efforts involving the fatalities involved, along with some debris is coming out as well. We will make sure that that perishable evidence is maintained. We have a great process for that. We will probably have more than one black box, so to speak. It's our understanding that the Sikorsky helicopter is equipped with some form of recording devices, and those will be read either by the DOD or by us. We have a good starting relationship with them, and we've already made agreements in order to be able to do that. So I feel comfortable in what we're going to be doing. The other question was about air traffic control. We received a very large package of information from the FAA at about 3 a.m., I believe, this morning. That is still being reviewed and analyzed. I would say there's a lot more information that usually comes in that than what you may find online and people might speculate about. And that is part of that overall process where we take the time to get the information correct and to make sure all the parties are engaged and involved and can fact check that information. One.
Dave Cohen from CNN. Can you tell me if the NTSB has reviewed this FAA internal report that has been cited by the New York Times indicating that the controller that was on duty at the time of the crash was doing a job that's usually done by two people?
We have not reviewed any specific reports about the controllers at this time, at least from the leadership team. Our investigators are continuing to pull all that information. Their personnel records, their files, where they were at, whether they were fatigued, all that information will be part of that investigative process. But right now, we can't speculate on anything that may have been reported in the media until we get the opportunity to validate and understand how it impacts the investigation. We're going to take just a few more questions. Sir?
Yeah, Orange Khanna, Deeper Magazine. What's the process and the logistics like of bringing the families in? Are they coming into the airport? And how are you going to sort of treat the sensitivity of bringing them to the place where this tragedy happened?
So the question is about the families. And many of those families are still en route. Some are still being notified from both the military and from the commercial crash. There is a family assistance facility that's being stood up by American and PSA Airlines in Bethesda, Maryland. They've already been working on that, standing it up. Our team from our disaster assistance team has also been coordinating with them. We plan on briefing them. It is customary that at some point, if the families wish to go to part of the accident site, that we would arrange such a thing, but it will only be when we know that it's safe, we have the correct perishable evidence, and we can do it in the proper modesty that should be for those family members. It will be a little bit of a process, but it will take some time.
Sir, to follow up on the air traffic control system.
No. Sir, or are you?
I know that Marielle Carbone with DC News now. We've heard from some witnesses that they saw people were able to come down the slides of the plane. Has there been any indication that people made it off the plane into the water?
Well, again, we will not speak to the fatalities. The DC medical examiner will, but I think the DC fire chief this morning very succinctly said correctly that we believe there are no survivors.
What were they off the plane? Like, did they even get out of the plane?
Last question.
So hang on one second. Right now, we're going through the debris fields. Nothing we've seen would indicate that maybe slides or chutes were deployed. It was a very quick, rapid impact, but we've seen nothing in that regard so far from the evidence we have, but we still need to verify all of that information. One more question?
Story Sample Safety 7. Sure. Are you going to be looking at the family member's cell phone?
Go ahead.
Jeff Cook, ABC News. What do you know about the altitude of the helicopter at the moment of impact? And can you talk about the procedure for such helicopters in that area?
The question was about the helicopter procedures. And in DC, it's kind of a unique environment. We've been getting briefed more and more by the FAA. I'm not an air traffic control specialist, but they're actually helicopter zones, if you will, or tracks. And this one was transiting, I believe, from track 1 to 4 as part of their normal procedure. If you live in DC, you see a lot of helicopters going down into this area. So there's a very well-defined system in that regard. As far as altitude, until we get the additional information, we can't validate or basically corroborate any of that until we get more of the electronic data and the data that's on the plane. I do want to clarify one question that also came about cell phones. You know, in today's age and time, a lot of electronics and other devices do contain a lot of different information. We've found on a number of our accidents that we actually are notified through a smartphone that may sense that. As part of our process, we will obviously treat all of the effects of the deceased with dignity. We are already starting to pull that information together. If we feel that it's necessary to find or pull some of that information, we will work with the families and make sure we do it in a manner that's respectful for them and their privacy. But right now, we don't have any plans specifically on that amount, on that area until we need to. Thank you very much.
You've been watching a live press briefing with the NTSB taking questions, limited questions here, less than 24 hours after the deadliest air disaster here in the United States in nearly 24 years. This American Airlines regional jet and a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter. There was some news that came from this news conference. In addition to laying out how they'll proceed with their investigation, they say very carefully it'll be based on the facts. They said it'll be 30 days was the number they gave until they release their report, unless there's any urgent change that needs to take place. They said they would step out in front of that report in 30 days. But they did break some news here during this press conference, and I just want to go over a couple of the things that we learned. They have not recovered the flight data recorders from both the regional jet and the recording device from the Black Hawk helicopter, though they made it very clear they believe both of those recording devices are still in the water. And we heard the NTSB say it's not uncommon that it would still be in the water at this point. They feel very strongly that they'll be able to get to that information. You heard the NTSB was asked about Defense Secretary Hegseth suggesting that there must have been some sort of a mistake last night. The NTSB would not go there, only simply to say that they will investigate all humans involved, all mechanics involved, the aircraft involved, et cetera, as they move forward in their investigation. They did reveal that the FAA, as of 3 a.m. this morning, did deliver a batch of research search information from air traffic control. I gather that will include communications and the logs from air traffic control, but we'll of course have to wait to report that out. They talked about this briefing actually coming before their meeting with the families involved, the families of the victims. They said that's somewhat rare to address the cameras and the public before meeting with the families, but they pointed out in this case, many of the families are still en route to the scene to meet with the NTSB. They said they do have their team ready to work with those families who are undergoing an unbearable loss at this point. And I want to bring in Gio Benitez. He covers aviation for us. And Gio, that was news that they don't have the data recorders yet, but they're very confident they'll get to them.
Absolutely, and it's critical, of course, David, that they actually find that. But there are so many questions here, and what you heard from the NTSB is a fairly typical first NTSB press conference after an accident, where they're sort of detailing the process of this investigation because it takes them so much time to obtain this. And a lot of times, what we see at the very beginning with these stories isn't what the investigation ends up finding. We saw that with the Alaska door plug when it flew off back in January of last year. We saw how that changed, and that's very likely what would happen here as well. There are some key questions, though, and certainly the Black Hawk helicopter being at 350 feet, that is at least what this preliminary flight data that we have right now says, because it was supposed to be at 200 feet or below. So that's going to be one question that they're going to be looking at for sure. By all accounts right now, the American Airlines plane had a normal approach as it was landing. That is what it looks like. The American Airlines CEO said that, and just about everyone has said that as well. But air traffic control, the question of air traffic control, at one point, air traffic control did tell the Black Hawk helicopter and asked the Black Hawk helicopter pilot, did they see the plane, this CRJ plane? Did they see it? And the Black Hawk helicopter pilot actually said that yes, they did. But moments later, that's when the accident happened. Now, President Trump earlier today did raise the question of, was that warning early enough? And so that's going to be something investigators are going to be looking at, Dave.
Big questions, too, about whether or not it might have been another aircraft in the sky that perhaps the team on that Black Hawk helicopter might have seen, because we've all seen those images captured on a number of cameras here in the Washington, D.C. area, different angles. And at that moment, there was actually another plane in the foreground, not far off from the actual regional jet and the Black Hawk helicopter that were involved in this. So many questions moving forward. And as Gio just mentioned, the altitude, that's, of course, early reporting here. We'll see if that bears out from the NTSB. They were asked actually about altitude and did not want to address that. They were also asked about whether or not there's any evidence that the emergency slides or chutes had been deployed on this regional jet. They said so far there is no indication that that was the case, but said, of course, it's still very early in this investigation. I want to bring in Martha Raddatz, our Chief Global Affairs Correspondent. Martha, you heard Gio mention the altitude there. Questions also for the NTSB here moments ago about sort of the flight patterns here and the routine training. You and I both know we often see Black Hawk helicopters over the Potomac, many of them carrying sort of diplomatic guests or members of the government, but many times they are undergoing routine training. And through your reporting, we've also learned that those who were on board the Black Hawk helicopter were very experienced.
They were very experienced, David, and they have done this route numerous times. This unit is in charge of what's called priority air transport. And just as you said, that's VIPs or leadership, whether that's civilian or military leadership. And what they practice is getting those people in and out of D.C. in an emergency, for instance, in a continuity of government. If something terrible happened in Washington, D.C., they would want to get those leaders, those senior leaders, out of the city for continuity of government. So these are important training flights. You had an instructor Black Hawk pilot on that flight and an evaluating pilot. And that instructor pilot would be helping the evaluating pilot qualify, something you just have to do regularly. It does not mean the evaluating pilot is not an experienced pilot. They just have to qualify probably once a year, and nighttime is part of that. We believe they had night vision goggles on. Pete Hegseth said that this morning. President Trump said he was not sure, but that is a very routine thing to do is use those night vision goggles. It's harder to fly, according to pilots I have talked to, with those night vision goggles, especially with a lighted city in front of you. They're great in the desert when you need extra light, but sometimes it's more difficult to fly when you have lights ahead of you. That is something they will definitely be looking at to see if perhaps that had anything to do with this, David.
And a quick follow-up for you, Martha, because one of the central questions, and there are so many questions this early on, but one of the central questions will be that conversation that's already been made public between the air traffic controller who was trying to reach out about 30 seconds or so. That's what's been reported before the collision took place to that Black Hawk helicopter, saying to be aware, obviously, of the regional jet. Do you see it? The answer was yes. And then the early reporting now, and you can hear it in the audio, is that air traffic control then reaches back out to the Black Hawk helicopter just seconds before the collision, asking yet again to wait for the regional jet to go by, and there was no response. That's going to be looked at very carefully here.
It certainly will be, David. And that helicopter, we can't stress enough, they were flying visual only. This wasn't an instrument landing. This wasn't, I can't see anything, so I'm going to let my instruments help me land. They had visual verification, so they said, of that regional jet. Obviously, there was a mistake made. We don't know exactly why or what exactly happened when that helicopter rammed into that jet. But that last transmission where you didn't hear them answer, that will be key. David?
Martha Raddatz with us here for our live coverage of this NTS briefing, the first of its kind with this investigation underway. Martha, thank you. One last question here from former Air Force pilot, ABC News aviation consultant John Nance. John, thanks for being here as well, because for people watching across this country, it's been more than 2 decades since we have reported on a deadly air disaster of this scope here in this country. And one of the things that everyone has heard at home already is that air traffic control audio. What do you make of the interaction between air traffic control, the Black Hawk helicopter, acknowledging that they saw the plane? Still unclear whether it was the actual plane or a different plane in that airspace as well that might have distracted them. And again, this is all just speculation and something the NTSB will have to answer. But when you see the video, you see the collision, and you hear the audio of the air traffic control, the exchange some 30 seconds before that collision, what does that indicate to you so far?
Indicates to me so far that there is almost a certainty to the fact that there was a confusion, and how that confusion came about is going to be one of the key elements of the investigation. But they acknowledged that they saw the jetliner, and I'm sure that's exactly what they thought they were seeing. But as you pointed out, there's so many lights around, there's so many opportunities to not have the right thing. I can't tell you how many times in my career, both military and civilian, I've accepted the responsibility and said, yes, I have them in sight, and hoped that I really did have the right one in sight, because it's very difficult. Also, the pace of communications is something that needs to be talked about. The communications are single, in other words, one push to talk, one voice, pardon me, in either direction at a time. And what you end up with is a situation where we have crammed as much information as we can get, and there's a lot of confusion that comes about when people are talking too fast.
And John, when you look at some of this early reporting and the numbers, when you're talking about that plane, you heard Gio mention this, that American Airlines has come out and said that their data so far shows that that plane was coming in for a very normal landing and had been told to go to runway 33 to change runways sometime beforehand, but had redirected and was coming in. And American Airlines so far saying that everything looked extremely normal, at least given what they've had access to so far. And the idea, the notion that this regional jet was some 2,400 feet from a normal landing there on the runway, it's just extraordinary that this would play out moments before all of those passengers would have been safely down.
I'm sure they didn't have any idea what hit them. And it was at such a low altitude, you're concentrating only on putting the airplane on the runway. It's right there in front of you. This is not the point in time in which electronics, for instance, could help you. We have a thing called a TCAS, a traffic collision avoidance system. It cuts out at about 1,000 feet because you wouldn't want it coming on saying dive, dive, dive when you're at 200 feet. The altitude is going to be one of the things, too. They're going to look at the altitude of both jets, but it does appear that the American Airlines was right where he was supposed to be.
And John, one last question for you. You heard the NTSB confirm what we learned from the fire chief this morning, and that is they believe there are no survivors here. They said moments ago there's no evidence that the slides or the chutes on that regional jet were deployed, though it's still very early. They acknowledge that. And there are also early reports that that fuselage, that jet is in at least 2 to 3 pieces in the water, as well as that Black Hawk helicopter. When you see that video of that collision, that explosion in the nighttime sky and where they landed, you'd be hard-pressed to think that anyone could have survived that kind of impact in waters that are 32 to 36 degrees here.
Yes, that's a very correct statement, David. I think, first of all, when I saw that and managed to evaluate it a little bit, the speed with which the fuselage or the remains of the airplanes and the helicopter hit the water, probably that was unsurvivable. But even if somebody had survived that, the waters were going to give you about at 36 degrees around maybe 35 or 40 minutes of useful consciousness, maybe less.
60 passengers, 4 crew on board that plane, 3 service members on board that Black Hawk helicopter, and we are thinking of them all and of all of their families. And you heard the NTSB say some of those families are still being notified as we're on the air right now. I'm going to return you now to regular programming. Our coverage will continue on ABC News Live, abcnews.com, of course, 24 hours a day. And then we'll be back with the entire team for a special edition of World News Tonight. I'm David Muir.